in the room? Good, okay, fair enough. Brilliant. And who enjoyed the premiere in Fire Alarm this morning? Yeah, excellent, fantastic. So I think it was poor Marianne that did the worst because she was in the shower. But I think everybody else did manage all right. But yeah, that was a bit annoying, wasn't it? So is everybody up for raring to go for today? Full of energy, enthusiasm? Yes, Trisha. Thank you, fantastic, brilliant. So, starting point for today. I'll let you introduce what you're talking about, Neil. We've got Neil and Tamsin and Eleanor. Lovely, brilliant.
Okay, good morning everyone. It's good to see everyone so bright and early. Of course, after your jollities last night, I'm sure you all went home and read in detail the EU withdrawal agreement. So it's understandable you'd be bleary-eyed this morning. We're going to be talking, building on yesterday's conversation, which focused on potential to build a social movement. We're talking about building a story of change around which to build such a movement. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the technique of framing and the opportunities that might offer to us to win the change that we want. And I really want to start by saying, and I was really struck by this again yesterday, that even though we may feel despair sometimes, I think the thing that unifies this group and came through strongly yesterday is that we're in the hope business, not the despair business. And the whole of Social Care Future has been about hope, about offering a different future around which we can all organise ourselves and support and pursue. But to really make that work, we need a shared story of change. We can spend all our time saying what's wrong, but the reality is no one else is going to set forward that story of the world that we want on our behalf. That's up to us. We have to tell that story. And the other thing to say in relation to that is that unlike other fields of social change, for example, if you're trying to combat poverty or promote the rights of migrants or build support for human rights, what's odd about this sector is nobody is on the other side trying to change the story, trying to make it bad, trying to tell a really awful story. The stories that we read in the press, the stories that the public hear about social care, are the ones that advocates of social care are actually telling every day. So there's a big opportunity to change the story so that it actually better fits the world that we want to see. Now my contention is that currently the story that's being told is not only failing to command public and political support for that world, it's potentially actively setting back our course, setting back what we're trying to do. So this is about telling a different story. You heard yesterday morning from Jackie from Nesta talking about social movements. If you read their report on health as a social movement, the first thing that they say that needs to be done in building any social movement is framing what that social movement is there to do. So we need a story that articulates the world that we want and that is built a consensus around the values and the ideas and the things that we're promoting. But at the same time, that story has to be able to speak to a bigger and broader audience. It has to speak to the wider public's understanding, values, the way they think about things, if we're able to win their support and expand that movement. So we're going to be learning about how to get our message right using the technique of framing, and also hearing about some work that happened earlier this year. I wrote a blog post on the Social Care Future blog about the way social care was being discussed. And off the back of that, the voluntary organisations, Disability Group, CBT and Dimensions kindly put some funding aside that allowed us to commission some early stage research. And Tamsin and Elena are going to talk about the research that we did into how the public thinks about social care and also how the media talks about it. So I hope that you will leave with knowledge and ideas, but we also hope you will leave with perhaps the sense that you might want to get further involved, because to take this forward we need a platform, we need resources, and we need people to participate and take part. So I'm now going to introduce Tamsin Hyatt from the Frameworks Institute. He's going to give you a very, very quick lesson in framing and what framing is. We hope you'll be able to get some sense of it, and then talk you through some of the findings we have around social care.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Grand. So I'm Tamsin, I'm a communication strategist with the Frameworks Institute. We are a non-profit communications think tank, which is a bit of a mouthful, But it means that we spend a lot of time working out not just what people think, but also how and why they think in that way. Okay? Yeah? All good? Okay. And then we take this information that we find out and we use it to help social movements, campaigners, campaign in a way that increases support and understanding. And we were commissioned earlier this year to provide some exploratory work on how the British public think and feel about social care. First, I'm going to start with why. Why we do what we do at Frameworks, and why framing social care, telling that new story, is key to creating change. In the words of George Eliot, "I'll tell you what's the greatest power under heaven, and that is public opinion. The ruling belief in society about what is right and what is wrong, what is honourable and what is shameful. That's the steam that is to work the engines." And for me, this insight captures exactly what we're trying to do here. We all want to better work the engines of society, to advance new ideas, new understandings, new behaviours, and to shift those ruling beliefs. And so public opinion matters. It can provide a fertile ground for change, or an arid desert where new ideas struggle to thrive. In other words, public opinion drives and preserves policy change. Now, it's by no means the only lever, but it is one of the most powerful. I'll unpick this a little bit with our theory of change at Frameworks. Communications can shape public discourse. And over time, the right communications have the power to shift public thinking, Eliot's ruling belief, in deep and abiding ways. And this isn't about getting superficial support or influencing behaviour in the short term. This is about changing how people understand and engage with an issue on a fundamental level. And we do this to create fertile ground and drive for lasting policy change. You may have noticed that this is a deceptively linear diagram. It's not always this straightforward. And sometimes an ambitious policy win means that we work backwards to make sure we can keep that policy in place by shoring up fertile ground and helping people understand why it's important. Because if we don't do this, we risk losing that win to the next decision maker as people come and go. Think, for example, of Cameron's order to get rid of the green crab after the Climate Change Act, May's pledge to scrap the dangerous Human Rights Act, or cuts to Sure Start funding after Labour. But we can do this with framing. And so we have a kind of common definition here. Framing is a set of choices about how we present information. It's what we emphasise, how we explain an issue, and what we leave unsaid. And this can mean making big or small choices, from the language we use to image placement or the values we invoke. And these choices can lead to radically different outcomes in thinking and behaviour. Because understanding is frame dependent. I'll show you what I mean here with some footage. This is taken from qualitative research on the framing of two different issues: addiction and early childhood development. Your challenge is to spot the difference in the before and after clips.
Somebody who's addicted to cigarettes chose to have those first few drags and rip the shit out of their throat and become addicted to cigarettes. Alcohol, they chose to have enough alcohol to end up addicted to it. As I said initially, leading to addiction is the susceptibility to addiction. And if you aren't exposed to it, and especially at sensitive times or at critical times, then you might not end up addicted.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development, in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional developments, the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
Oh, did anyone notice the difference?
Yes.
Is anyone brave enough to shout out what their difference was?
It's like hypnosis, isn't it? They completely change their idea of what causes addiction or stress.
Yeah. So the first man goes from pure choice to susceptibility and biology. The lady goes from stress is normal to stress damages development. These are both big shifts in understanding, one that campaigners working on this issue are seeking to build. And there's one more thing you may have noticed from these clips, one that is maybe even more important. Did anyone get that? Well, in his second response, the man begins with, "As I said initially." The lady says, "In my opinion," both times. He did not say that initially, but that was her opinion, both times. Psychological anthropologists call this the variability of salient structures. But what this actually means is that human beings are contradictory. We are complex. And we are capable of thinking very different things and much more accurately about something if we are given the tools to do so. And the tool here was a frame. Between takes, these people were read a short, well-framed, well-tested way of talking about addiction and childhood development. But not all frames are created equal. The right frame is able to cue and equip people to think differently, to improve public understanding and point towards effective political and social solutions. But not every frame will do this. I'll show you what I mean here with an example from our work on reframing criminal justice. We wanted to increase support for reform and new policies. We tested two different policies, two different frames even, against the control group. The first, problem solving, played to the idea that we Brits are cool-headed and pragmatic, and we need a common sense and practical approach to solve our over-reliance on prisons and punishment. The second message led with the facts, that our criminal justice system is costly and inefficient, and investment in rehabilitation saves money and improves outcomes. What's interesting here is that campaigners, groups advocating for reform, were typically using that cost efficiency frame. So here's what happened to people's support for policy change when they were exposed to these differently framed messages. So the problem-solving message increased support to a statistically significant degree. The cost efficiency frame actually decreased support. It was worse than saying nothing at all. Does anyone want to guess at why this happened? Yeah?
Because there's no votes in it. There's no votes in rehab, as far as I can tell, unless you give them a chance to explain why or not.
Potentially. Anyone else? Yeah?
Austerity?
Austerity, yeah. We don't want to think too much about funding here. Anyone else? Yeah?
Is it something about the right good thing to do versus, oh gosh, the impact on me?
Exactly. So when we used that cost efficiency frame, it activated existing patterns of thought around justice as something more than transactional, about the right thing, and that you can't put a price on justice. So this means that the choices that we make when talking about our issue, when talking about social care, matter a great deal. They shape how people think, how people feel, and are willing to act. So the first step towards making these choices is understanding the landscape. What, how, and why people think what they do on a given issue. So with this in mind, Frameworks researchers conducted what we call on-the-street interviews on social care earlier this year. So they're designed to explore top-level thinking, providing empirical data on shared patterns of thought. So what I'm about to show you is by no means a complete picture, but there is a decent sample of views that will provide some insight and aims to start conversation on that existing landscape. So we asked the British public, what comes to mind when I say the word social care? Sorry.
It's very difficult to hear.
Sorry.
Right.
What do you guys think about what you've just seen?
All of it is true. In the first bit, it was about other people, but in the next bit, it was about it included themselves.
They used the word looked after all the time. It wasn't about people having lives, it was about looking after.
They want the same look where the policy makers on the people.
Okay. So when we recommend frames, we recommend frames that work across the spectrum of public policymakers, so on. This is a snapshot, so initial findings. So that's something that we could do later on, but I think Neil will talk to that a bit later. Any more responses?
It doesn't seem that everybody's got an idea what social care is about. Everyone's got their own opinion about it.
I was enormously struck that the answer was money. That it felt to me like everybody was really clear that we just needed more money.
Two things were missing. The focus was on old people, which is fair enough, but I think that shows ignorance of me much more generally. And secondly, there was nothing about attitude to people and respect and appreciation. It was about doing things too. So a second thing that needs to be changed by all of us.
I think it was really interesting that in the first question there wasn't too much certainty about what social care actually was. But in the second question, people seemed extremely sure about what would make it better.
I thought it was interesting that people didn't recognise that it was something that belonged to them. It was somebody else.
Like that gentleman said, it's usually for older people on 43, and I've had social domiciliary care for the last 3 years, and it's been the worst time of my life. So much so that I ended up at crisis point and taking overdoses because of relationship breakdowns, because it's out of their way, and if you say something, they then probably care. Yeah, drinking for me. Everyone being in this room matters because people are hearing a voice. So, definitely.
I'm surprised that so many people mentioned that it was a human right and an indicator of how we treat people in society. I wasn't expecting that to come across this
in the back time, you had got massive floods, flames, and cracks, and you're throwing the inaccessibility of the public environment, and then just going about how social care fits into the whole network of uncontrollable access to trauma. And that really was a picture.
Basically what we choose to say and what we choose not to say. It's about values. Because most people are seeing when we talk about social care as vulnerable people, but it's about also not talking what's not being said, it's about human potential.
When I heard it, like the lady across said, things about, human rights and stuff, but there seems to be an illusion that social care it's that thing that's funded, that is a service, that we do things to people, and there wasn't a lot of response about the responsibility that we all have to support our neighbours or our friends, or what people's gifts are that can be contributed.
Last one.
Changed the mind when you started to think about social care perhaps something that they might use. And so initially it was about where the people need help. And then the second time round it was, well, I might need this. And when it became, I might need this, then it became human rights. I can't imagine.
Okay, so you've picked up on a lot of the kind of key points of what we found from this bit of research. The definition of social care is very hazy. People often used social or variations of care or looked after in their responses, using that as a crutch. And there wasn't much in the way of consistency when people thought about what and who social care is for. So a lot of focus on older people, but also younger people, the foster system, benefits. And very few mention care as meeting anything other than basic needs. And what was interesting is that even within this hazy definition, there was that clear sense of who social care is for, the vulnerable and the frail. So people who needed social care, again something you guys picked up on, were often described as helpless in well-meaning but very marginalising terms, as people who couldn't look after themselves. And the second dominant pattern within these interviews was about the state of social care, an almost universal acceptance of crisis. Despite people not knowing what social care was for, these respondents still described social care and the social care system as poor, a mess, or broken in some way. Solutions are harder to see and think about than problems, but even when prompted, these respondents only saw one solution to the current state of social care: money. And they weren't able to articulate much more beyond this. Which leaves us with a few challenges when talking about social care, when framing our asks for government from services and from society. Our first challenge is overcoming crisis and fatalism. So even within this small snapshot of public thinking, crisis frames dominated. The social care system was broken, in a mess. And our research found deep patterns of fatalism imbued in these diagnoses. The government, who was seen as ultimately responsible for social care, was described as inefficient, bureaucratic, and even with more funding, unlikely to change for the better. It's worth asking, and I think Neil and I think everyone in this room has been asking that, where this dominant story about crisis comes from, and how helpful that story is to the change we want to see. All of our work at Frameworks across a range of different social issues indicates that a pure crisis message rarely delivers the effects we would like it to. These frames either cue disbelief or trigger the conclusion that these problems are too big to be solved. Vulnerability, our second challenge, and again a very dominant way of thinking about social care within our snapshot group. Because when we talk about vulnerability without context, we risk presenting anyone who requires support as objects of pity, without agency of their own or as problems to be solved. And this mirrors challenges from our work on reframing ageing in the US, where default thinking around older people drew on ideas of frailty. Which leads to our third challenge, fairness. When asked why does social care exist, some respondents drew on ideas of fairness, that older people in particular had given much to society and this needed to be repaid. But when we cue ideas of fairness, we also cue ideas around deservingness, what we do or don't deserve, and that evaluation of individual choices that leads to entire groups of people being dismissed as undeserving, as less than. And our recent work on migration cautions against triggering this kind of zero-sum thinking, where supporting one undeserving group is seen as taking supports away from another. But we also have some opportunities here. Often when we're trying to change narratives, trying to tell a new story, we're in competition, not only with the stories told by others, but also with the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our world. But from our snapshot, the definitional story of social care is hazy. There is space for our definition, our own story to take root. And none of our respondents dismissed social care as inherently bad for society or for the individual. Our second opportunity, again, a bit of a mixed bag here, funding. Said with caution, because this is tied to that deep sense of crisis and fatalism I mentioned earlier. But every respondent mentioned more money, more resource as a means to improve social care. So again, assuming our snapshot is representative of the whole, a funding ask is in line with public thinking, and so with the right framing, is likely to get public support. What remains the question mark here is how this relates to less transactional asks, to asks that require systems change or social infrastructure or that interrogate the way the existing funding is allocated. Which leads to our final opportunity, and one that a few of you picked up already. Moral imperatives. So when asked why does social care exist, some respondents talked about fairness, but others described social care as a moral imperative, a way to respect our human rights, to live our values of social responsibility, protecting those who need it, and to secure equality of opportunity. And for me, this highlights our strongest potential vehicle or frame for change. An opportunity to shift the story of social care from a broken system for broken people to a recognition of the humanity in all people. To tell a story about efficacy driven by the moral ties that bind us to one another and to our world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tamsin. So I said there's a whistle-stop tour through framing. Please go and read more. There's stuff on the Social Care Future website, Frameworks Institute website, and elsewhere, and we can circulate information afterwards. So that's why it's important what we found when the Frameworks Institute went to talk to people on the street. But we also did a piece of research to kind of gauge how the media was talking about social care, which Elena Semino from Lancaster University is going to talk about now.
Okay, brilliant. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Everyone, yeah. Can you hear me too loud?
No, sorry.
Because that is the problem I have. Okay, so I'm a linguist, so I think I need to spell out what I bring, which is one of the challenges I was given as I came into the building. I'm the kind of linguist that works with colleagues to look at how we talk about things, especially in public communication, in order to understand, in our case, the current framing of social care. Tamsin has shown the framings that we get when people are asked, what do you think of when you hear social care? What we did is we looked at how the press in the UK talks about social care. And you won't be surprised that the framings we found are quite similar, because the media both reflect and reinforce what people tend to think. So I'm going to be very brief. There's a blog post that we wrote on the Social Care Future blog that has more detail. So, first of all, what do we do? In order to get evidence of current framings in the press, we collect a hell of a lot of data. So what we did was we took a period of about a year between 2017 and 2018. We took 8 national newspapers. You've got them on the left: The Guardian, The Times, The Mail, The Independent, The Telegraph, The Sun, The Mirror and The Express. And we looked for articles that included the phrase social care. Then we put them all together in a big bank of text that we call a corpus, and overall we ended up with 2.5 million words of news articles. Okay, so life isn't long enough to read them all and look at how social care has been talked about, but we have some clever software. And one of the software that we have, we're able to say to the software, look at all the instances of the phrase social care. Then look 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right of social care and tell us what company the phrase social care keeps in this massive collection of news articles. What kinds of words turn up around social care? Okay? And that is one way of getting at framings. So you won't be surprised. These are the top 20 words that turn up much more around social care than they turn up around other words. There is the biggest group is to do with funding and finances. You've got funding, you've got budgets, you've got cuts, fund, sustainable, etc. So you can see that the fundamental framing is about issues to do with funding and how much funding there is. But also we found, and these things are ordered by how strongly they keep a company with social care, you can see that in 4th position is crisis. So the crisis framing that Tamsin has just talked about, not surprisingly, also applies to the media. So here are some examples. I don't have time to read them all in detail, but you can see that the articles talk about a funding gap, spiraling costs, and the crisis in social care, which rebounds on the NHS. Now, we also looked at how people are talked about in the... Oh, there's a missing slide, but never mind, I'll mention it anyway. We also looked at how different groups of people, specifically the elderly and people with disabilities, are talked about in this data. Concerning the elderly, there are 2 conflicting framings, and Tamsin has talked about how we often hold contradictory beliefs, even at the individual level. One is of the elderly as victims of insufficient social care, and the other one is the elderly as a burden because of the aging population and the costs associated with that. So those are the 2 main ways in which elderly people are represented. Then we asked ourselves, and actually Neil was asking, how are, and I quote the phrase that we looked at, disabled people represented in our data. First of all, they're not talked about as much as the elderly. They're talked about half as often. And usually when somebody in this data is presented as disabled, they're also either a child or elderly. So there's not much talk about disabled adults. And one of the things that is missing, and this is about opportunities, one of the things that is missing in these articles is any sense of people with disabilities working and contributing to society. The discourse is about vulnerability, and often multiple vulnerabilities. So that is a story that is just not being told, at least in this vast amount of data. So basically, to conclude, the framing in the press is primarily a framing to do with crisis that is due to funding, lack of it, and an aging population primarily. But there's very little emphasis on solutions, so it's primarily a discourse about problems. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elena. So I think what we see there, I imagine, many of you, is a fundamental gap between what most of you in the room think and feel and aspire to, and what the public is being told and what the public think. The public are seeing and hearing social care primarily as a cost, primarily just about basic life and limb support. They're not hearing about the aspirations of working age disabled adults. They're imagining or hearing values and ideas of vulnerability and frailty. So there's a gap here. But the opportunity, as you said, is the public doesn't really understand this. So they're kind of relying on information that they're kind of grasping from here and there. What I would say though, and this is a piece of research we need to do in more depth, but from a very rudimentary look at the communications of a great many NGOs in this space.
What's an NGO?
Sorry, charities. It is them that are pumping out the crisis communications and telling a story of social care, which is just reduced to washing, feeding, getting up. They can understand the politics of that, sort of sense of despair, sense there is a crisis, we just need to get to the next stage and a bit more money and a bit more money. But the reality is this is a debate that's been going on for at least a quarter of a century. In 1996, Tony Blair said nobody should have to sell their home to pay for their social care. We're now a quarter of a century on and we've not cracked it. So my contention is the story that is being told is at least in part responsible for that. Because we're telling a story that is creating, Tamsin said, fatalism, which is where the intention of talking about crisis is to say something must be done about this. But the effect of it over time is that people think, well, nothing can really be done about this. So we have to change that story and we have to push it onto more hopeful, fertile terrain. But that takes research and it takes time and it takes work. And that's what I just want to talk about briefly before we show you a sort of a film evidence of the difference that this kind of work can make. And I've just put that slide in there, some of the kind of themes that came out of this. Crisis, pressure, crumbling, vulnerable people, and you can all test this afterwards. Go out of here, Google, or do it now on your phones if you want. Google social care, kick images, that is the one that overwhelmingly will come up. It's a stock image and it's absolutely everywhere. And that is a frame, that is the idea many people will default to in their heads, or probably more likely as well an image of somebody in a care home. So that's what's coming to mind for many people when they think about the issues we're concerned about. So what is this about, what it's not about? It's not about measuring and responding to public preferences concerning how social care is funded. That might be part of it. And that, sadly, is much of what this debate is about. When Martin set about this effort, Social Care Future, one of the ground rules was, we're not going to talk about funding. That's there, it's part of this debate, we can't ignore it. But we want to talk about the social care that we want, what it means and what it does and why it's valuable. So that's not what this is about. And actually I should say now, it might not be about social care at all, because we might want to actually abandon that idea and talk about something else entirely, but that's probably a bit too much to get into today. It's a scientific approach to framing public understanding, as you've heard. Others are doing this work. So this isn't, we're not offering something new here that no one else is trying out. One of the most significant pieces of work going on currently around this is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's work to reframe poverty. And there's a lot of information on their website about that if you're interested and you can find out more. Again, they have a major campaign to end poverty in the UK, and slap bang at the heart of that is telling a better story. To try and move away from the strivers versus scroungers narrative that's been there around social security into something that can move us forward. There's work going on reframing homelessness that Crisis are doing. The Robertson's Trust in Scotland are doing work on reframing children, the story of children in care. So lots of different organisations and movements are thinking about this at the moment. And importantly, as Tamsin said, it's not a silver bullet on its own, it's part of a jigsaw. It has to go alongside putting forward kind of credible, practical solutions and policy proposals. Has to go alongside and is part of social movement building. So this isn't something you just do on its own and it kind of changes everything. It's part of a broader process of change. What's involved? So the research we have is really at the foothills of this. This is kind of basic stuff just to get a sense of where the debate currently is. If we want to move it forward, we need to look at what experts and individual experts in the broadest sense, those affected by social care, those who are working out, those all of you, think and say about social care today and what you want for the future. So there needs to be a degree of consensus about what the story is that we want to tell. And that's an absolute key part of the work and quite a challenging element to it. We need more data about how the public thinks, the cognitive interviews that you saw there, more survey data. We need to look at existing communication strategies. So I've had a superficial look at how these various charities are communicating, but we need to look in more depth at how social care is being talked about and the impact that has on people, how that leaves people thinking about social care when they read it. We then need to begin thinking the sort of frames that could...
What are the values we need to promote? The ideas we need to put across?
Metaphors that we might use to help people understand social care. And we need to carry out research to test those. And then the upshot of that should be kind of a way forward that will help us all think about how we can talk about social care, or however we choose to recast social care in future. Then, of course, we have questions about how we use that data. Is that about training and helping us all use it individually? Or do in future we want to actually develop a campaign? We want to develop a campaign around these messages and these ideas to bring about that future, but that's something down the line. And I'm not going to show that film, but we're going to show another one now. Tamsin can cue that up. Does anyone, before we show you this film, does anyone have any questions or comments?
I can share it. I can share it, sorry. I can share it. So just to say, from the NHS England Personalised Care Group, there's been efforts to engage with practitioner communities, and what we've noticed over time, that probably been backing up or challenging on this, is that there has been a change in perception around things, particularly like personal health budgets, where for some time publications like Pulse were really anti, and now they're not. So there are shifts in opinion. It feels like that would be a really complementary piece of work to do, to look at what specialist press from different kind of clinician groups would be saying were the major stories around health and social care. But we think that there is some ground that we've made over the last couple of years from just the work that group's been doing. And I don't know why or how, but there is something there that's interesting.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think it's always worth remembering that professionals are people and are kind of equally affected by dominant frames, even though there might be kind of specific motivations within systems like the NHS that you also need to contend with and deal with to move people forward.
Well, I was thinking I was thinking about schools, and I wonder if you'd ask people who've grown up in school with disabled children in the school and what their view of all this is, and the people who haven't had that experience, because in my experience it's completely different.
I think that's a really important point, and one of the challenges we have here, because what we were perhaps hearing from people wasn't their attitudes to social care, it was their attitudes to the people they associate social care with, and therefore that leads us into broader questions about attitudes to disabled people and older people in society. So I think yes would be my answer, but it's something we will need to think about carefully and taking the work forward about how broad we try to go. Somebody's that, sorry.
I think we've heard a lot about data, we've heard a lot about what other people think. As someone with lived experience, as a family carer, I want to be talking about what we here in the room today are going to do, how we are going to start our campaign. That's what I want to be talking about. I don't want to keep hearing about other people, I don't want to keep hearing about data, I want to hear about what action we're going to do.
That's a fair point. I think all I would say is that this is about informing that action, and part of that action is to be able to reach and persuade people that you need to reach and persuade with any campaign, and an absolute key to that is learning how to tell the story of what you're trying to do effectively. So this is absolutely about action to kind of change that terrain. It's not, I need to understand that what other people think is to be able to do that as well as possible, not to put their priorities first, if you like.
But what time should the session finish? You don't have time to start thinking about that? Because it says we can usually by
we gave them an hour to introduce this stuff, and the point of this is to ask people the question,
does it sound like we need to tell a different story and use this methodology to tell that story differently? And most people in the country don't think it is. And most people in the sector don't think we need to. The charities are telling the wrong story. Local government is telling the wrong story. We've got to come up with our story, and we've got to use this kind of method to be effective in telling that story. So what we're trying to do today is find out whether people agree. If people agree we need to tell a different story, then let's organise ourselves to work out how we're going to do that. This will be my answer to that.
And also, I did chat, I don't know if there is space later, but if there is anyone in this room who wants to spend some time later thinking forward, I'd be very happy to hang around all
We've got
day.
space opportunity later on, so if people really want to get around that question, where do we go from here? Let's do that.
Yes.
As I said before, it really has impacted me, domiciliary care. It's been the worst years of my life. And that picture that we put out there is always hand holding, but it's not my hand, it's not other people's hand.
It's a really powerful point about power in that system and how we can change that. And I guess this is a means to an end. What I think we all share an interest in this room is changing that power relationship so that you're not subject to those sorts of things. This is just one technique by which we might help or begin to achieve that. Gary next, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to say that, I was going to say that the social care should be part of the national health scene and working together. And I feel that there's got to be more in the social care for working class adults as well. And like the National Health Service is for everyone, social care should be for everyone.
I think that's a really important point. It's seen as a kind of thing for other people, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, we need to change the message, but there's a lot of people with learning disabilities up and down this country that have lost their voices because they've lost their local self-advocacy group. We need to build, if we are to change the message, we need to rebuild people with learning disabilities and people with disabilities' voices.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think if you think back to Eleanor's point from the evidence, that, and also the public thinking, positions people as vulnerable, it positions people as objects of care. There's rarely anything in that about people being, if you like, in charge of their own lives and their own spokespeople, and you know, that's evident in what's happened in terms of self-advocacy in other areas as well.
What sort of thing?
So it's just something, sorry.
Answer me. What? Difficult. This government closed the which we must fight, get back. It is not working.
I think the point he's making is, initially, social care did care in the home. The ILF did stuff when you went outside, when you went to college, when you went to the gym, wherever. With the closure of the ILF, social care no longer looks at that part of your life. They're looking just at what care you receive, and that they're cutting.
Yeah, and again, if you come back to the link between that and the story that's being told and heard, nobody's telling the story of care and support that's giving people a broader life. It's all just about life and limb care in the home. So if we want to kind of defend those things and defend independent living in a broader sense, then we have to be out there telling that kind of wider, broader story of what this is really about. Sorry, you and them, sorry. So, there was somebody that's over here.
I've seen something that was shared on Facebook on Tuesday from the evening paper in Oldham about a new care village being built there. Who owns this care village? Michael. Who's the main shareholder? Oldham Council. And who's one of the people on the board of that company? The Commissioner, Mark Warren. Well, that does make it a bit hypocritical when councils are trying to put people more inclusive in the community when on the one hand they do villages which exclude us. And there's another company based in the Trafford area called HPV. They have places like this all over the country. They have one down the road from their office in Timperley, and that's even more too close comfort for people in GM and Cheshire Mersey, two in St Helens, and they've just acquired an old shop building in Warrington and they plan to turn it into flats for people with disabilities. This is unacceptable!
A crucial point really well made, and again I think this comes also back to language, because the scheme that's being developed in Oldham, if you read the press release and the newspaper thing, it's going to create jobs for people in Oldham. It's described as offering people independent living. It's an institution by any other name. And we need to begin challenging those models and those ideas, invisible institutions that are appearing all over the country. So that is also about framing the language.
You're conscious that when you're trying to change the rhetoric of the here and now, there's another generation coming through that are being still embedded into the traditional one. And even though for lots of adults using social care, the reality is when a baby's born, it's health that's the most immediate support system around them before social care kicks in. And the narrative there is still very much about need and misery and lifelong dependency. So yes, I agree about changing the current narrative, but unless you get in now for that, because families believe very quickly. I think by the age of 5, unless you're challenging that narrative, the damage is already done. So
yeah, and I also think at the other end of life, I think this isn't just about how the broader public feels. I think in my own experience in my parents' current situation, this narrative affects the willingness of older people to engage with the social care system and to see it as a threat rather than something that's actually going to extend their independence. So it's got a very kind of real meaning in those individual conversations and perceptions, hasn't it? We're going to have to wind up, but we just want to show you a quick film before we do, so you kind of see what this can mean in action.
So does everyone here remember the NSPCC advert around child abuse with the Full Stop campaign? Yeah. So that was a kind of formative advert of my childhood. Very, very bleak, very, very scary, and it has stuck in popular consciousness. We are doing some work with the NSPCC and a few other children's organisations on reframing child protection and child development. And here is one of the adverts that we have worked on together.
My name's Alfie. My dad died when I was 3. So it's just me and my mum. But a few years ago, she met a man called Alan. He started off being nice, but when he got drunk, he hit my mum. One night, he came home and punched me in the tummy. It really hurt. When we got back from the hospital, the NSPCC started to help us. Now we see them a lot. Mum says we're going to be okay. My name's Alfie, and I'm national.
When a child is free from abuse, they're free to dream again. We help keep 1 million children a year safe from abuse and neglect. Your donation can take a child anywhere.
Do you want to say anything about that?
So it's a big shift from previous framing. And one of the biggest shifts that we've worked with the NSPCC to achieve is a sense of hope, of freedom, of what can happen when a child is free from child abuse and what that child can go on to do. And that's a big shift in framing, in presentation, from the kind of despair and terror of the Full Stop campaign.
So I think the important message there is this isn't about negating the problems or the challenges that we're facing or kind of ignoring them, but it is about giving people a sense of why we're doing this. Why is what you do valuable to people in the round? What is the difference it makes to their lives? And making sure that first and foremost our communications concentrate on that, the change that we're trying to bring, not the current kind of problems that we're in. And so if you take one thing away, as I said at the beginning, we're all of us in the hope business rather than the despair business. Let's just make sure that that's how we communicate about what we do as well. Thank you.